Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the San Francisco Playhouse, our community's empathy gym, where we come to practice our powers of compassion. And here we are. I would say that normally, and there would be a cheer go up among the crowd, but now, of course, we're in the pandemic, and so we've been relegated down to 2 weekly television shows. We have our Zoom Lit series on Monday, and tonight on Thursday, we continue with our fireside chats with some of California and the country and the world's greatest playwrights. Before I get any farther, I want to thank the Ohlone people who lived on this land for so long and so beautifully and stewarded this land for us. And I want to express my gratitude and our company's gratitude and acknowledge our awareness that there were people here before us who lived in such harmony with the land. Well, it's been a great series. We've really enjoyed doing it. We've seen so many of the playwrights that you've enjoyed, and as we begin to do our what is our 18th season here, as many of you know, our first selection is going to be a play called Art by Yasmina Reza. Few of you probably who go back that far remember that there was a previous production of Art at San Francisco Playhouse in 2004, in the summer of 2004. And we were well into that run, I think, in the summer. And I was in the play. I played Serge, and we were about to go on, and the ticket seller came running back to the dressing room and says, "Oh my God, the playwright or the translator and the adapter of the play is in the house." And so we were very lucky to have this wonderful playwright show up to San Francisco spontaneously and watch our production. So it's interesting that we've come full circle, or we've come through another circle with Art. And so I'm very, very delighted to welcome tonight Sir Christopher Hampton.
Evening.
Good to see you. Evening,
Very
yes.
nice to be here.
Good evening. We're not sure really what time it is. Does anybody really know what time it is yet?
It's about 5:30 here in England.
In England, but you're not actually in England now, are you?
I am now. Yes. No, I was in Vienna last week, but by the magic of rarely enjoyed air travel, I've come back.
So tell us a little bit what was going on in Vienna.
There's a marvelous theatre in Vienna called the Theater in der Josefstadt, and those of you who've seen the film The Third Man will remember that there's a theatre that Joseph Cotton visits, and it's that theatre. And for the last 25 years, I've had a very good relationship with them, and they've done several plays for mine. And recently, I've taken to putting on my new plays there to start with, and sometimes directing them myself, so that I can kind of try them out before I bring them to London or America. And so last year they commissioned me to write. They asked me to write a play based on something by Stefan Zweig, who is an Austrian playwright, novelist, and they made a few suggestions, but it so happened that I'd always wanted to try to dramatize a very short story, called Letter from an Unknown Woman, which consists of basically a 24-page suicide note. So that's what I did. The play is called Visit from an Unknown Woman for obvious reasons. And I've just it just opened it last week before a very, I hope, discerning Viennese audience, because this is one of their favorite sons, Stefan Zweig. So I was a little bit nervous about that, but it seems to have gone very, very well.
Fantastic. So I introduced you as Sir Christopher Hampton because you very, very recently achieved that lofty status.
I did last in what's called the New Year's Honors at the beginning of the year.
And the Queen, were you in presence of the Queen for that?
it was all scheduled, but I think for sort of pandemic reasons, all of us are kind of waiting for things to settle down before we actually get to go to Windsor Castle or Buckingham Palace or wherever it is.
And receive the sword on the shoulder.
That's right.
So that's, yeah, so it's a virtual knighting.
So far.
I guess it's a knight you become when you become a sir. I don't know.
That's
but
right.
How does it feel? That's interesting. That's such a great distinction.
I know, it's very, very. I mean, it's very sort of touching and satisfying. Yeah. But I don't know that it doesn't make you feel any different. It's just a very nice thing to happen.
Yes, doesn't make you really stand up any straighter, particularly, you know.
No, not really, or hopefully be any less subversive.
Yes, hopefully, definitely. So I think basically the job of a playwright is to be a subversive.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
You agree with that?
Very much so. Yeah. And it means that if you have a long career, you get used to. It's not so crippling to get bad reviews as you always imagine, because sometimes bad reviews will herald a play that's going to last a little longer than maybe plays that have had better reviews.
Is that right?
I can think of. I can think of plays of other people. I remember being at the first night of Harold Pinter's Betrayal, which got the worst reviews you could possibly imagine, and is now, of course, one of his most popular plays.
A classic. Yeah.
In my case, it's a play called Tales from Hollywood, which is one of my particular favorites.
Yeah, I love that play.
Which was very poorly received at first, and has somehow sneaked back into people's regard.
Managed to find a life,
Yes.
Life of its own. I think. Do you think that maybe that some plays get poorly reviewed because they dig and they ruffle some feathers from the.
Well, I was very lucky. When I started out, I had a great agent called Margaret Ramsey, a legendary agent.
Yes.
And the first time this happened to me was my second play, which was called Total Eclipse, which we were all very confident about and felt was much better than my first play, which was called When Did You Last See My Mother, and which had been very well received. And it got just appalling reviews. And Peggy said, I think by way of cheering me up, she said the thing is that if a piece of work is pretty original, there's always something ugly about it. She said that was the word she used, and I think this is true. There's a certain kind of abrasiveness and ugliness that attends certain new pieces of work, which just takes a little bit of time before it gets swallowed. And it turned out that Total Eclipse went on to be probably my most performed play, and eventually in the 90s was made into a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. But I could never have foreseen that in 1968 when one devastating review after another flopped through the letterbox.
You must have just been devastated.
Well, I hadn't got the equipment to deal with it at that point, and I'd only had one play which had been absolutely praised to the skies. So it was actually a very useful lesson, because I knew in my heart that it was a better play, and therefore I sort of readjusted my defenses, I suppose.
Yes. Well, I read in your bio that you are actually the youngest playwright ever produced on the West End.
It's true, only by a few weeks, but it is true.
Well, who did you beat out? Do you know?
I think Noel Coward.
Wow.
Yes,
well, that's a distinction now. Sir Noel Coward. Yes.
Yes.
Wow. And that was for your very first play, right?
It was. We'd put it on at Oxford, where I was a student, and in those days, where there was a much broader base of theatre criticism in the newspapers, somebody from The Guardian came and reviewed it. It was just a student production.
Just out of the blue, by happenstance.
Yeah, and it within 6 months it was on in the West End, which was, a bit kind of dazzling at the time.
Well, that's quite a story, really. And I gather that you didn't go to college to become a playwright.
I'd always wanted to be a writer,
Right.
and I had written a novel when I was a teenager, which was rejected by every publisher in London, probably quite rightly. And then, with the sort of ignorance and innocence of youth, I thought, oh well, that didn't work. Maybe I'll try a play. So that's when I wrote When Did You Last See My Mother while I was just before I went to college, actually. Wow. And it took a bit of time, took a year or two to get on, to get someone to do it. And it was after that everything went very quickly. So I wrote the play when I was 18, I think.
Yeah. So you obviously had a bit of a knack for it.
Well, I never sort of imagined that I never sort of dared to imagine that I'd be able to make my living as a playwright. So, as a writer. So, and my father, who was very, parents often throw up their hands in horror if their children want to do something like that. But he was actually very, very supportive. Yeah. All he said was, get qualified so you could do something else. By which I think we both had in mind teaching. I suppose I thought I would wind up teaching if things hadn't taken off.
Well, that's what you were doing at college. You were studying.
I was studying French and German, which is actually it was also due to a marvelous piece of advice from my French teacher, who was a real mentor, a man called Harry Guest, who's a published poet, who said to me, because I was planning to go to university and study English, which would have been logical. He said, "Don't do that. Go do French and German, and then you'll have direct access to two other cultures." And as it turns out, that decision shaped my career, really.
Absolutely. And he was, how did you know him? Was he a teacher at your school?
He was my French teacher. He was my French teacher at high school. Yeah, and he was everybody needs at least one really inspiring teacher.
Yeah.
In my case, it was him, and we're still friends. He's still alive. We're still friends. He had this. He made this very clear intervention in my life, and changed its course.
Well, not everyone knows that big part of your career has been adapting and translating works of art that were originally written in French.
Yes, go on.
No, you go ahead.
Well, the novel that I read when I was 19 was of course Liaisons Dangereuses, and it was part of the course, and I'd opted to do modern French literature, which in the case of Oxford University at the time was 1782 to 1920, and right at the beginning of the period, therefore one of the first books I read was this astonishing novel, and it was one of those novels I kept going back to, and at a certain point, I guess I was probably still in my 20s. I said to Peggy Ramsey, "Do you think it would be possible to write a play from Les Liaisons Dangereuses?" Because the complication of it is that in the novel, neither of the main characters, Valmont and Mette, never meet. They just write letters to one another because it's one of those epistolary novels. So technically, it's difficult to imagine how you would dramatize it. But she thought it was a great idea, and in fact nagged me unmercifully for several years until I sat down and did it in the mid '80s. But I first suggested it to the National Theatre in 1976, and they said, "Well, I don't think this is a very good idea. After all, the main characters never meet one," and so on. So in the end, I just had to write it.
Yeah.
I got an open commission from the Royal Shakespeare Company, and I just wrote it, and they were not at all pleased when they got it, as I recall. But which relates to what we were talking about a little earlier.
Right. Exactly.
But in that particular case, although the play had been written for the new theatre, the Barbican, which is a 1,000-seat theatre in London, they decided to put it on in their 150-seat studio theatre in Stratford-on-Avon,
I did not know
the other place. And that was a very helpful decision, I think, for the play. And it's one of the few things I've done that got unanimously well reviewed as soon as it opened, and kind of took everybody by surprise, because it was the last play of the season, and they scheduled it for 23 performances in this, basically a tin hut and a car park, which is what the other place used to be.
Well, that's an astounding story. It seemed just wonderful to hear you talk about the mentors that pushed you forward. Your French teacher.
We all need them. And in the theatre, I guess my mentor was William Gaskell, who, as a young director, had worked in Olivier's National Theatre, and then went in the mid '60s to run the Royal Court Theatre.
Oh yeah.
And after my first play was on,
was that at the Royal Court? Was it?
Yeah, it was the Royal Court first, before it went into the West End.
Yeah.
He, a couple of years later, '68, when it was time for me to graduate, he invented a job for me at the Royal Court, resident dramatist. There had never been such a thing in London before. And
dramaturg?
Sorry?
Resident dramaturg or?
No, resident dramatist.
Oh yes, dramatist.
So the idea was that I would go there for a year, and I would. He said, "Don't be fooled by this. We actually shorthanded, and we're going to ask you to do everything we can think of." But technically, in order to get the grant money from the government, from the Arts Council, we will portray you as a writer who needs to write a play. And so I went, and it was a real. You know how important it is for people who want to work in the theatre actually to work in the theatre. And I was able to do everything. I was able to go to Lindsay Anderson's rehearsals and watch Ralph Richardson and John Gielgud. I was sent out all over the country to see any new play. I ran the literary department, so I was looking to find new writers.
Right.
And I was generally completely immersed in the life of the theatre. So much so, actually, that about 9 months into it, I said, "Bill, I actually don't have time to write a play here. So this is what do you suggest?" And he said, "Well, if you can find someone who will assist you, we can probably afford £7 a week."
With your chores, right? With your life.
So I hired David Hare, who was my assistant for the next year, and then he took over as a resident dramatist.
Right.
So
what a good story. And I wonder who David Hare passed the assistant.
Well, he passed on to Howard Brenton.
Now, see, I knew it was going to be that. It's going to be the story.
Yeah, he passed it on to Howard Brenton, who later, with whom he later wrote some very good plays.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, it's so interesting, the things that form us, the things that, make us who we are, the people.
Well, we sort of need that bit of luck. We need someone to take an interest and help us. And Bill I remember when we were rehearsing that play I told you about, Total Eclipse, which was about the French poets Rimbaud and Verlaine.
Yes.
There was something the director, who was also very young, and I knew there was something wrong with the play, but we didn't quite know how to fix it. And Bill came along to a rehearsal one morning, and he looked at the play, and he took us out to lunch, and he said, the thing is there are things wrong with the play. But he said to me, you're very young, and so it's best if we put the play on as it is and let the audience teach you what works and what doesn't.
Right.
Now, it's inconceivable that anyone would take that kind of view today, where everything is a workshop within an inch of its life. Yes?
It's a wonderful view. We've had our regular, 6-play main stage season, and we moved to a much more bigger theater, 300-seat theater, really, really nice, a block away from where you were. That was our first place. And it was leaky, and the cornices were all falling down, and they were about to tear it down to retrofit, the earthquake-proof it or whatever. And we went in there on a month-to-month lease. We didn't have any continuity at all, but we just started doing plays. And now we're 2 places since then, but we have a regular season, and then we started up what I call the Sandbox season, which is in smaller venue, like in the 100-seat theater, like the one at Stratford, little black box, and we take plays that are developing, young playwrights that haven't had a production at all, often, or a play by a somewhat well-known playwright that somehow missed, nobody picked it up, and it just sat there for a number of years, and I went, wait, there's nothing wrong with this play, let's do it. But people won't take the risk of putting on a $500,000 production on these plays, so we do them really bare bones, and we use young designers, and we rehearse longer than a regular play. And we just, I often feel that way, that I've given notes to the playwright and they've nodded their head politely, and that what it needs is to get that audience, so that they understand how important an audience is. And then inevitably they go, oh, I get it.
Well, in fact, I did rewrite it. I think we did the play again in London 13 years later in 1981, and David Hare directed it. And I was able to fix it. In other words, I was able to identify what had been troubling me, which I couldn't have done, I think, in the heat of putting it on for the first time.
No perspective.
I needed some perspective, exactly, and so that was, really due to the enlightened and kind of supportive actions of the man who ran the theatre.
Right. Was he the founder of the theatre?
No, the theatre opened in 1956, famously with its third play was Look Back in Anger in its first season, and was run by a man called George Devine. Who was an actor-director.
But from the very beginning, the Royal Court's been devoted to new work, right? Was there?
Well, yes, it had. It's been in various incarnations, and at the beginning of the 20th century, it was Bernard Shaw's theatre. So Bernard Shaw and Granville Barker put their plays on there, but then it became a kind of a touring house and all sorts of things until 1956, when what was known as the English Stage Company took the theatre over, and within 10 years, which was my first play was on there in 1966. So within 10 years, it had become really the most famous theatre in the world.
I think so.
For new work, and that was due to George Devine, who actually died in 65, I think. So that in 66, when my play was done towards the beginning of the year, Bill Gaskell had just arrived to take over from George Devine, who had more or less dropped dead in performing in a play of John Osborne's called A Patriot for Me. It was one of those stories where he was taken off the stage feeling ill and died in the night. And he was an extraordinary example of a man who completely gave his life to the theatre. And in the course of doing so, transformed the English theatre.
Well, it's a great story. I actually was just a couple of weeks ago talking with Simon Stevens.
Yes, I know Simon very well, and admire him. I think he's a very, very good writer.
But I think he also got a job at the Royal Court running teaching when he wasn't anybody at all yet. I mean, he was just a beginning.
That's right. He came into the education department, I think, which is something that grew sort of long after I'd been there. I think at a certain stage he also became the resident dramatist.
He did.
But anyway,
he did.
Anyway, he certainly had a number of plays done there.
But I know the Royal Court gave him a leg up as well, with by giving him that job, and it allowed him to be a permanent theater person,
Yes.
So I think he'd been teaching at little schools in far from London.
The north. He's from Manchester, I think.
Yeah, he'd been teaching high school, I think. He didn't, but he somehow got this job at the Royal Court, miraculously. We met him too. He came to San Francisco. I don't know where I got the idea, but somebody had started passing me his plays, and I read a play of his called Harper Regan.
Very good.
And we decided to put it on, and he was very happy to see this American production of Harper Regan, and came to see it. And then we've also run into each other in London a few times. I remember one time we were having coffee, and I said, "So what are you working on?" He says, "Well, I'm about to start adapting this young reader's novel, into a play." And as a U.S. citizen, I'd never heard of it, and obviously that became his great adaptation.
Yes, and transformed his life in pretty much the same way that Dangerous Liaison transformed my life, I think.
Yeah, and it was borrowed literature for you both.
Yes.
I think it's such an interesting thing. He's done a lot of adapting besides that.
Yes.
I think he also did some Ibsen. Didn't you do a Doll's House and a couple of those?
I did. I've done I think 5 Ibsen plays over the years. So I love Ibsen, and I love Chekhov as well. So I've been lucky enough. I've done 3 Chekhov plays. So those have been very sort of nourishing. And actually, this is also interesting in the sense that it dates back to the period we've been talking about. It was the Royal Court in those years, at the end of the 60s, that suddenly decided, instead of when it came to mounting a classic in Ibsen or a Chekhov, instead of using the regular academic translation that everybody else had always used, Constance Garnett or whatever it was, they suddenly decided, I think it was Bill who said, it's actually more important to have someone who can write dialogue than someone who can translate languages,
literature.
And so they began this experiment, and they started with The Seagull, which Anne Jellicoe did.
Mm-hmm.
Then they did Three Sisters, which Edward Bond did, and then I was asked to do Uncle Vanya, which I did for Paul Schofield and Colin Blakely in the very early 70s. It was a seminal production for me. It was really a tremendous learning experience to work with actors of that quality.
I think it must be really thrilling to feel the spirit of this other great writer. It must get into your blood, and you sort of feel like you're channeling Ibsen or Chekhov or Yazdi.
Yes, people say, why would you want to translate a play? First of all, I think I think translators have always been underrated and undervalued for what they do. And secondly, why would you not want to spend a couple of months taking a masterpiece apart and putting it together again? It's like if you want to be a watchmaker, see who made the best watches.
I think that's a great way to put it. I think it's I have always been a great admirer of translations and the idea of translation, because you're not just translating words, but you're translating a culture. What is it like to translate a work by a Norwegian into English, or a French woman of Iranian extraction? So you sort of got to get into their head. And then what are the connections between two completely different eras? How do you bridge that?
I know what actually, of course, I don't speak Norwegian, but I worked out a way to do the Ibsens, which worked very well for me, which was that, of course, in the sort of height of his career, Ibsen was a sort of self-imposed exile in Munich, right. And most of his plays were done first in German, and he had as it were, a tame translator. He had someone who worked at his request, and so since I can speak German, I was able to get those original translations from the London Library and set them down next to the original Norwegian, and you could kind of pick your way. Somebody said that Norwegians like speaking German underwater. Well, there are similarities in the languages, and you could see it was just a better way of doing it than working from, which I had with The Doll's House, which was the very first one I did, from a literal English, literal English translation.
Well, it must be a little like having a Rosetta Stone.
Yeah, that's right.
This is how they say it in Norwegian, and this is how they say it in German. So you can kind of triangulate that in a way to how that idiomatic expression, or how that cultural expression could be done in English.
That's right. Now, with living writers, there's a slight difference in the section.
Such as Yasmina, for instance.
Inconvenient presence of somebody who's liable to have their own opinions, very strong opinions, since they originally wrote it. And so with Yasmina Reza and with Florian Zeller, it's a completely different ball game, really, and it's very, very interesting working with people like that. And of course, they're all very different. Yasmina's very demanding, and pounces on things that she thinks are not quite accurate enough.
Right.
And when I did art, which was the first one I did, her English was less good than it is now, so she was not so much on my back, as it were. But since then, she's got better at English and more, but in a very constructive and helpful way. And finally got to the stage where when we did Got a Carnage on Broadway in I don't know when it was, about 2009, something like that. We were able to contemplate translating it again, but this time into American.
Right, into American.
Yeah,
it's a different culture. It's a different kind of English.
It is, and ever since then, whenever I've had a play that's played in London, a translation, I've made sure to attend the rehearsals and change it where it needs to sound American rather than English.
Right, but it's got to come out of the mouth of the actors. I've actually got to go in a minute because I'm going to go into rehearsal for art. But I wanted to tell you how much I'm enjoying. What's that?
Are you still playing Serge?
No, I'm directing.
Oh, you're directing.
Which is nice because I'd acted in it so long ago, and it's in my bones, and I know the play so very well after having done it 80 times. But something we discovered, like we cast the play with people that are different ethnicities. There's nobody white Anglo in the play. And I just did that because of the times we're in. We just I feel like we need to open up the classics to
I completely agree.
different types of people. And the guy playing Ivan was born in Tehran, and you know, is English. He grew up here. He's an American, you know, but his heritage is very, very much Iranian. And he really knows that woman, the mother. And he tells me that this is more like a woman from the north of Iran, up near the Caspian Sea, because there the women are very, very dominant and strong, and as opposed to the sort of more submissive female in the Muslim female in much of the other part of the country.
That's very interesting.
I know, it's so interesting.
Up towards Azerbaijan, and they get more assertive.
Well, I think Yasmina knew that woman as well. You know, so it's interesting to see that the cultural energy of
that
an
is very
Iranian
interesting.
actor.
Of course, Yasmina is everything you could imagine when you say the word Parisian. She's incredibly sophisticated, and
Oh, sure.
but it's very interesting that she has these strands of Iranian and Russian flowing through her, and Hungarian, and I mean, I think
she's quite the cultural diversity within one person. There's a lot going on there. So listen, I just sort of, I often describe to my patrons and to the public, I just talk about how I cherish playwrights and how I think the theater is the playwright in a way, and of course the actor too. But I describe playwrights as the prophets of our time, and because you guys have more sensitive antenna, I think, and are able to pull down information from the tumult and turn it into a story where we can see ourselves somehow. It gives us some perspective. And so in terms of prophecy, I wonder if you would share with the folks a little bit, what are you feeling about this time, and about writing, and about the future of theater, and about the future of the world and theater as it reflects the world?
Well, it has very much affected me, more than at any time I can remember in my life. And I think the last 3 plays I've written have all been set in Germany or Austria in the 30s, either before or just after Hitler came to power. And I think that's no coincidence that I've been drawn to that, to trying to understand what would what is at the back of populism and nationalism and all that kind of thing. And actually, the play that I planned to write this year and researched in America before, I've been sort of planning this for 2 or 3 years, is a play about the starting point of which was the death of a black civil rights activist called Jimmy Lee Jackson in 1965, and he was shot by a state trooper completely arbitrarily in a cafe, and the state trooper has actually only recently died and was finally tried about 40 years after having shot Jimmy Lee Jackson, and did, I think, 3 or 4 months in jail in Alabama. This was the play I'd been working on, and this was the play I wrote this summer. Of course, tremendously sharpened and heightened by what was going on every day on the TV.
Right, every day. Well, so you are using those prophetic powers of yours. I think, especially the interest in pre-World War II era. I think we're going through a similar time in terms of its apocalyptic potential, and we don't know how it'll turn out.
Well, we all hope the train can be derailed, and that's really the purpose of doing this kind of work. Yes.
In that way in which a playwright can be subversive and subvert the course of history a little bit, give it a little nudge off the track here and there. Sir Christopher, thank you so much.
Thanks,
For
Bill. Thank you
giving
very
your
much. I've
time
enjoyed it.
and your perseverance with getting the video to work. And thank you all of you at home so much. I wish we had a full house, but what we have now is we have houses full of people who love theater and who want to get something to chew on while we're not able actually to gather at the theater. Thank you so much.
I hope to see you all soon in San Francisco, a city I absolutely love.
Well, that would be great. Let me know if you're coming and we'll wine and dine you.
Okay, great. That's a deal.
Thank you again. And we'll
Thank you.
see you all next week.
Thanks. Bye.
All right. That was terrific. Thank you so much. It's so